Everyone. Thank you for joining the APLF webinar, and I'm Xavier from APLF Hong Kong, and I'm the host of today's webinar. This is the 8th webinar sessions, and thank you for your continuous support and be with us all the time. In the following weeks, we will invite speakers from the leather and fashion industry to share the viewpoints with you. Please stay tuned on our websites and our social media platforms for the updates. Also, we're recording the webinar and you can see it on YouTube after the webinar. Feel free to check with all the panelists and attendees in the chat box. You can select the recipients from the drop-down menu. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type in the Q&A box, and you will see this icon at the bottom of the screen, and we will answer you in the Q&A sections. Towards the end, we will ask you to complete our survey, and you can find the survey after exiting the webinar. Please take a minute to fill this out before leaving us today. Your feedback is very important to us to improve the future webinars. So today, we have a great honor to have Stephen from the Leather and Hide Council of America and Farah from the Hidenet to be our speakers. The former Ursula is a full-service industry trade association representing the entire U.S. leather supply chain, providing government, PR, and international trade assistance and support to support their members, as well as education and technical information. And Hidenet, they produce reports of in-depth industry analysis of raw cow hide prices. So let's welcome Stephen and Farah. Hello, Stephen and Farah.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Xavier. How are you?
Hi, Xavier.
Yeah. Where are you guys right now?
Upstate New York.
Or what about Stephen?
Yeah, I'm in Washington, D.C., East Coast of the U.S.
I see. Is the pandemic already like covered, or are you still under lockdown in the States?
Well, for us, we just started the first phase of coming out of lockdown from the pandemic, but then we ran into some protesting and rioting situations in the last couple of days, which has sent us back into a lockdown. So it's been a long couple of days here.
Yeah, I believe like working from home made everyone become experts on online meetings. So shall we start your presentations?
Sure. So we're really happy to have Steve with us today because of the top level perspective on the US industry that he brings, and especially with his interactions with key people in Washington, like the Secretary of Agriculture and the trade representative. He really has his finger on the pulse of what's going on with trade. And leather might be one of the most well-known materials in the supply chain, but it's probably also the most misunderstood. And while sustainability's been the mantra across the supply chain for a few years now, somehow, in some cases, leather has been maligned as the kind of the antithesis of sustainability and ethical production, which is not at all true. So we're lucky to have Steve here this morning to talk about how it's actually our ethical duty to use leather produced from our cattle. So Steve, take it away.
Great, thank you, Vera. And as Xavier said, we're all learning how to be experts in these technologies, so I'm hoping I'm going to do this right. We'll start. Let's start at the beginning. Okay, there we go. Well, thank you, Vera. Really appreciate it. Thank you to APLF and Xavier for having me here this morning. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. So as I said, I am in Washington, D.C. currently, and I'm getting very tired of being in my makeshift home office here. But I hope this webinar finds you all safe and healthy. So as Vera said, I am going to talk today about our ethical duty to use leather, specifically the hides and skins that we produce from meat production and dairy production for leather purposes. I'm going to focus quite a bit on cattle production and beef production because that's our primary material that we produce in the U.S. But a lot of what I have to say does hold true for other industries as well. So I'll focus on the beef aspect of it, but know that what I'm saying largely has implications for other parts of the animal agriculture industry as well. So my message today is very simple. Leather is a byproduct of food production. We as humans need food. That's no surprise. Animal agriculture and animal protein is an important part of our food production. And as long as we are producing animal proteins, we are going to have byproducts that we're going to need to use in order to be sustainable. Leather is obviously one of the most important of those products. We have the ethical duty to use those products. We don't want to be wasteful of those products. And unfortunately, as we'll discuss later, we are not doing that right now. We're being very wasteful and not using our beautiful natural resources adequately. So just really quick, a little bit about our association. The Leather and Hide Council of America is a new name for two very old organizations. So we recently went through a merger. It was the U.S. Hide, Skin, and Leather Association merged with the Leather Industries of America. That was as of January 1, 2020, so of this year. But the history of those organizations goes back to 1917. So we have quite a lot of experience here as an industry association. As mentioned, we are the industry's voice for everything from meat packers through hide processors, leather tanners, traders, chemical companies, and everybody involved in the leather supply chain in the U.S. So let me first talk a little bit about the very basics of leather production and hides and skins production. As many of you know, leather is a byproduct of food production. We need these we make these materials because of our food needs. But let's dig into that a little bit. Let's talk about why we do that and where some of those trends in that industry are going. So first of all, very simply, why do we eat beef? This might be a basic question for a lot of you all, but basic information. But it's important for us to remember this. So why do we eat beef? Why do we eat ruminants? Well, because ruminants are the original upcyclers. They have stomachs that are built to take plant material that humans cannot eat and turn it into proteins that we can. So naturally, cattle and bison and buffalo and other ruminant animals have produced this ability to take these plant matter and turn that into proteins that we as humans can eat. It's important to remember that, especially for cattle, 90% of what they eat is forage and plant leftovers. So grass that we cannot eat, marginal lands, plants and marginal lands that we cannot grow crops on, and plant leftovers from crops we do produce. So in the US, for example, after we produce corn or soy or maize, there's a lot of plant material left over in the field after those plants have been harvested. And the first thing we do is send in the ruminants after we harvest it, because there's still a lot of plant material there that they can upcycle and use, and that we can then turn into a food source through them. In the US, we typically grain finish our animals, our beef animals. So we use corn, soy, and other grains as a way to finish our animals. We do this for a number of reasons, but one of the main reasons we do this is because it enhances that efficiency as well. Grain finished cattle provide about 19% more human edible protein than they consume via those grains. So a lot of times you'll hear this argument that if we just stop producing animals, stop producing animal proteins, that we could use a lot of that farmland to produce vegetables and other plant materials for human consumption. And that's just not the case. A lot of this land is unusable. A lot of these plant fibers are unusable by humans. And so therefore we do need what ruminants are able to do for us. I think it's really important and kind of a fun fact to remember, nature did this for us. In the 1500s, it was estimated that there were 60 million head of bison roaming the plains of North America. These were naturally produced, naturally evolved animals. These were not put here by humans. So this is something that nature has come up for us. It's part of a natural cycle. And this is why we eat them as humans. So let me just talk to you quickly about a typical life cycle of a U.S. beef animal. I think a lot of people, if they are not familiar with the beef industry, may not have an understanding of where a cow lives its life in the U.S. So happy to kind of dive into that a little bit. Most of our animals will start in the cow-calf farm. This is where they are born. It's open pasture, open range. They spend 6 to 10 months of their lives there with their mother cows typically, and then they are either kept there for most of their life, or they are sold to another farm that's called a stocker or a backgrounder, who again puts the animal primarily out on pasture, out on grass, eating other inedible plants, eating a lot of the plant-based material that I explained earlier. This would be another 2 to 6 months of this animal's life will be spent in stocker or backgrounder. Finally, if in the US, like I said, we do finish our animals. So if we send our animals forward for finishing on grain or other human inedible plants, they'll spend 4 to 6 months of their lives in a feedlot in the finishing stage if they're eating grain, or they could spend 6 to 10 months on grass. Feedlot animals can be fed either grains or grass, so it's not one or the other necessarily, and their diets are managed very closely there. So I just want to give you quickly some quick pictures of what each of these stages look like. Depending on where you are in the world, this may or may not be familiar to you, but if you look at the picture on the left side, this is what a cow-calf and a stocker or backgrounder phase of the animal's life would look like. This is just a wide open field, open grass. Those lands might be usable for human edible plants. They may not be. These might be fields that are being restored. So they're just planting grass and letting the animals consume the grass while the nutrients in the soils are being restored. So this is a typical rural view of North America, and where a lot of our animals will spend most of their lives just being happy cows. And then if you look to the right, I've provided a couple pictures of what a feedlot looks like. Now, I think depending on where you're coming from in the world, you may not have a concept of what a feedlot looks like. So I think it's important to see it. A feedlot is not a confined feeding system. It is not a captured feeding system like you might think of with foie gras or something like that, where an animal's force fed. These animals are free to roam. These animals are free to exhibit their natural behaviors. But what they are doing is being fed a highly balanced diet of grains or grasses, and they're being monitored very closely for weight gain and other health issues prior to being sent for processing later. So these animals are not being forced to feed by any means. They want to. Grain is very tasty for cows, and so it's very easy to get them to come eat that plant material. So Peter, I'm going to stop here for a second. I think you might have a survey question for everybody.
We have a poll for you. So you can make your choice here. Agriculture accounts for what percentage of greenhouse gases? Take your best shot.
I'm going to take it too, even though I know the answer.
Me too. I cheated. So has everybody got that? I think we have to wait for Xavier to, there we go. Okay. So 56% of our audience think it's 9%. And 25% is about a third of the audience, and 11% of our viewers think it's 67%.
All right, great. Well, we have an educated audience here. That's fantastic, actually. So the 56% of you are absolutely correct. And hopefully that means you all have seen either my presentation before or somebody else's related to our organization. But for those of you in the 25% range, the 67% range, happy to talk about this a little bit and get into this with a little bit more detail. I'll make sure. There we go. So let's talk about greenhouse gas emissions in the beef industry. This is obviously something that most people are now seeing in the popular media, so it's something worth discussing quite in depth. Unfortunately, this is an area where not a lot of context is usually provided for our greenhouse gas emissions from cattle production. And so it's very easy to manipulate the data to make it sound like the beef industry is one of the worst carbon footprint or carbon producers in the world, which is just not the case. So I've got quite a lot of information on this slide, but let me dig into it a little bit. Let's start with the top left-hand graphic. So this is a breakdown from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, so our governmental agency that oversees greenhouse gas emissions and is the official reporter of our greenhouse gas emissions to international bodies and everybody else. So if you look at breakdown of industries in terms of who's the largest producers of greenhouse gas, transportation, 28%, electricity generation is 28%, industry produces 22% of greenhouse gas emissions, and agriculture is about 9%. I think it's a little closer to 10% in the latest data, which just came out about 2 or 3 weeks ago, but between 9 and 10% of all US greenhouse gas emissions are coming from agriculture. And then finally, you can round it out with commercial and residential at 6 and 5% respectively. So let's talk about that 9% greenhouse gas emission number from agriculture. Let's break that one down even further. So that is all of US agriculture producing 9%. Now, if you look at only animal agriculture from the US, that's only about 3.9%, so less than half of that total number. And if you look at cattle production in the US, it's about 2% of greenhouse gas emissions. So I know this is very different than what you've probably read. I know it's very different from what you've probably seen in popular media, but this is the direct report from our government agency regarding this number. So that 2% of greenhouse gas emissions is direct emissions from the animals. So primarily belching. This is enteric fermentation. It's what happens when the ruminant animal takes on the plant material in its stomach. What it produces is then belched out. The vast majority of what's belched out is then in the form of methane. Methane, as many people know, is one of the worst greenhouse gases that we have in terms of its warming potential. So methane has a warming potential of 28, which is quite high compared to carbon dioxide. But it is also a very misunderstood greenhouse gas because it does not stay in the atmosphere forever. Methane will break down in about 10 years. And it breaks in, and now I'm focusing on the right hand of the slide here. It will break down after about 10 years, and it turns into carbon dioxide as well as other gases. And this is the most important part of this, it is then part of the cycle where it is then recycled back into the plant matter via photosynthesis and begins that cycle once again. So this is known as the biogenic carbon cycle. It is something that's been happening for thousands and millions of years in the globe, and it's something that the world has been able to sustain itself on, because as long as cattle numbers stay relatively even, we are relatively flat in terms of how those gases cycle through. Now, this is very, very different than the problem we're facing with greenhouse gases and global warming right now, which is fossil fuel-based extraction, production, and CO2 going directly into the air, so in the atmosphere. So this is a one-way street. This is taking a petro-based product, a fossil fuel-based product, producing something with it, transportation, electricity, whatever you have, and then sending it into the atmosphere where it stays forever. It does not break down in the same way as methane does. So I think what you're going to see in the coming years is you're going to start seeing that people are going to look at these two cycles, these two emissions very differently. So emissions are not all the same. They do have different properties to them. I think what's also important to note is I think everyone has a pretty good understanding of the concept of a carbon sink. And so we all know what carbon sinks are. They are primarily plant material that is able to absorb carbon from the atmosphere and sequester it. And again, the cattle production cycle, the ruminant cycle, is an integral part of this process. When cattle eat the grasslands, when they eat the plant material, they are consuming it, and then those plants are then regenerated after they've been eaten. So in the U.S., our carbon sinks from plant sequestration is around, I believe, 11% of our total greenhouse gas emissions. So about 9%, 10% of agriculture of greenhouse gases is produced by agriculture. And then we also have about 11% sequestration. So you can see, again, this is a fortuitous cycle that's been developed. And it's very different than what we should be focusing on from greenhouse gas emission perspective, which is our fossil fuel-based consumption. So finally, I will just mention this. It does get controversial very quickly anytime I mention this study on any presentation, but it is worth noting. If you look at the bottom left corner of this slide, a couple of years ago, the U.S. Department of Agriculture did kind of a thought study, and it was a peer-reviewed scientific research paper, but it was a thought study and said, what would happen if the entire U.S. agricultural system went 100% vegan? We removed all animal agriculture from our production system. Well, they did find our greenhouse gas emissions would lower. They would lower by about 2.6%. And you're probably saying, well, wait a second, that's not the 3.9% that animal agriculture produces that you said. Well, and that's true. And that's because you're going to need an increased use of synthetic fertilizer in order to produce those plants that you're not getting from animal agriculture, where it currently is producing much of that. You're also going to have increased soil erosion, which does release gases in greenhouse gas form. And most importantly, they found that there's likely that there's going to be insufficient nutrients to feed the U.S. population in such a production system. So as many people know, the U.S. is a net agricultural exporter. We feed both the U.S. population and much of the world as well. And under this study, at least, they said that we would not be in a position to be exporting protein or nutrients, and we would also have problems feeding our own people. So final point I'll make on this is I'm talking about U.S. numbers. Global numbers are very different on greenhouse gases, but for a number of different reasons. So total livestock production in global greenhouse gas is about 14.5% of global greenhouse gas. And the differences are due to a couple different reasons. One, the U.S. is a developed country, so we are using quite a lot more in transportation, electricity, and industry. So obviously that will change your percentages. But also our agricultural system, especially our animal agricultural system, is very efficient. And so it's quite a bit more efficient than a number of other developing regions. And so therefore we are able to produce more with less. And Vera, I think I'm going to stop there. We have another poll coming up.
We do. Here we go. Did the U.S. raise more or less cattle in 2019 than in 1977? Was it more last year or less than in 1977? Let's give people a minute to answer that. And we need that game show music.
The opening music would have done well.
Yeah. So 68% of our audience believes it was less last year, and 32% believe it was more last year than in 1977.
Great, thank you all. Again, we have a very educated crowd, so I appreciate that. It is less in 2019, so the 68% have, again, either seen my presentation before or know quite a bit about this area. But for those of you in the 32%, let's talk about that next. So I mentioned in this slide that as long as our cattle numbers remain the same, because of the methane breaking down over 10 years, we're not going to add any new carbon to the atmosphere. So as long as our animal numbers are staying the same or going down, we are not impacting total carbon in the atmosphere. And what I'm really happy to report, at least in the United States, is we've reduced the number of cattle in our herd by 33% since 1977. All of this while producing the exact same amount of beef that we did in 1977. So we are getting a lot more efficient as an industry and able to produce a lot more with a lot less. So how do they do that? Better animal health and welfare. Obviously, we want healthy cattle. We want them to be treated well, treated right, and not lose a lot of animals to disease or other natural causes. Better animal nutrition. We understand a lot more about an animal diet now than we used to. So we're a lot better able to produce animals in an efficient way using less inputs. And finally, and this has been a big one, is animal genetics. Animal genetics, there's been a lot of research that has gone into this. There's a lot of money that's gone into this. Believe it or not, bull semen is one of the most expensive traded commodities in the world right now, and it is shipped all over the world. So really kind of a great story showing that we are quite efficient in what we're doing and actually reducing our GHG emissions as an industry. Okay, so let's talk quickly about animal welfare as well. We can't talk about beef production and animal agriculture without animal welfare, obviously, and this is a very important area. So at least in the US, we have a very robust legal and regulatory framework that surrounds this area. Again, this is like the greenhouse gas emission issue. This is probably an area where, from the popular media, you believe that every animal is treated horribly, they're tortured, they're this and that, and that's just not the case. A lot of those situations have been cherry-picked and amplified by groups that are anti-animal agriculture to begin with, and so it makes it seem like every single animal is treated incorrectly and there's no oversight, and that's just not the case. So we do have a legal and regulatory framework overseeing every stage in an animal's life. For example, and this is one that kind of surprises people when I mention it, there's an U.S. Department of Agriculture inspector, animal welfare expert inspector in every single processing plant in the United States. So that inspector, who is an employee of the government, has the ability to shut down the plant, to stop production if they see animal welfare problems or if they see animals being mistreated. So this is a little bit different than a lot of other systems in the world, but it is something that the industry is very proud of, works very hard to ensure that the animals are being treated correctly, and is obviously backed by government action in case they misstep. So on top of those regulations and on top of those laws, we do obviously have quite a lot of industry best practice and certification programs. They cover every stage in an animal's life. Different industry bodies, depending on who they represent in the supply chain, have different programs. So there are programs for beef and dairy animals while they're on the farm. There's a different welfare program for animals while they're in a feedlot situation. There's an animal welfare program for transportation of animals when they're moving from one farm to the next or from farm to the processing plant. And then finally, there is a protocol that covers the processing plant itself. And I include this picture of Temple Grandin here. This is actually Claire Danes playing Temple Grandin in a movie. And that's because Temple Grandin is Dr. Temple Grandin. She's an animal welfare expert. She is the one that has developed most of our animal welfare programs, especially in the processing plant side. And she by herself has a fantastic story. And if you haven't seen it, I really urge everyone to check out the movie with Claire Danes playing her, because it's really kind of a fantastic story. Okay, so that's just a little bit about beef production and especially our system in the U.S. Many people know this, but we consume beef and dairy because we need it. We as humans need the nutrients that are produced from that food source. By 2050, many of you know, we'll have 10 billion humans in the globe that we're going to have to feed, and we need to be using every protein source, every nutrient source we can in order to feed those people. But as a tenet of sustainability, we also have a duty not to be wasteful. We shouldn't be throwing away any of our natural resources. We should be using all parts of the animal, especially because the animal is giving its life ultimately for our sustenance. So we have a duty to that animal, an ethical duty to use everything that we produce from that animal. And unfortunately, we're in a situation where we're not doing that. But leather is one of those major byproducts that we do need to be using and utilizing in our beef and dairy production supply chain. So let me just talk about that leather as a byproduct point real quick, because I think this is another area that gets warped and very quickly depending on who your source of information is. So many of you have probably read articles that have said the leather industry is a contributor to deforestation in Brazil, or name your topic, and they try to link leather to a lot of these other major issues around the world. Well, the truth is leather is a byproduct. A hide is a byproduct, and it's very easy to see that and determine that. So what I've done here is pulled a report. This is a U.S. Department of Agriculture report that they release every single day. I pulled it from May 28th, and it shows the price of all of the products that are produced by a cow in the U.S. that's not meat. Okay, so it's all the different byproducts. The cattle hide is the most valuable of all of those products, but when you group them all together, the byproduct value, or what's called the drop credit in the U.S., is 6.8% of the value of the animal. So all of these products, 6.8%, the hide is the most valuable of that 6.8%, but on a per animal basis, it's only 1.25% the value of the entire animal. So 1% of the value of the animal. There's not a farmer, there's not a rancher in this country or likely in the world that is deciding whether or not to produce another animal, to feed another animal, to hold on to the investment in another animal based on the cattle hide price alone. It's just not happening. So this is a pure byproduct of cattle production and something that we as an industry do not control necessarily when it comes to supplies. So, and this graph just kind of shows that again. It shows how dire our situation is in terms of the value of those byproducts, but showing you also that we as an industry do not control the number of hides we're receiving. So this is an average of the value of all of those drop credits, all of those non-meat products. If you look at the red line, the average from 2014 through 2018 was between 12 and 13% of the value of the animal was all those non-meat products. But the blue line, if you look at in 2020, that's the value for this year. And that's been a large driver, has been the value of the hide because of the lack of our usage of that hide for leather production. So we are now below 7% the value of the overall animal for all non-meat products. And the hide is obviously one of the biggest drivers of that decline. So I mentioned it before, we're not using the hides, the valuable hides the way we should be. We're not putting them into leather production, and we are, from a sustainability perspective, being wasteful. As many people on this webinar know, one of the reasons for this is the rise of plastic synthetics. They've been able to take a lot of market share away from leather in a number of different product lines, and they've substituted leather out, but leather as a byproduct of another industry has not necessarily corrected itself in terms of supply. So now we just have this surplus of hides that we don't know what to do with. So, and I popped forward there, but Vera, I think you had one last survey for
we have
us.
one last poll for our audience. So how many cattle hides were wasted in 2019? Was it none, 450,000, 1.3 million, or 5.5 million? And have our answer coming shortly. Okay, 5% of the people think none, 14% answered 450,000, 41% said 1.3 million, and 41% said 5.5 million.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I hate to say this, I hate to be reporting this, but we estimate we lost or wasted about 5.5 million US cattle hides in 2019. So 41% of you, again, are educated consumers here. So this will be my last point, and then I'm happy to take questions. So our association estimates we wasted about 5.5 million US cattle hides. So that would have been 17% of 2019's production of cattle. So we produced about 33 million head of cattle in the US in 2019. We estimate, based on a couple different data points that we have in the industry, that about 27.5 million cattle hides, give or take a few, of course, made it into the leather supply chain, either through exports or domestic leather production in the US. And we don't think the vast majority of those 5.5 million hides made it into some sort of a holding facility or warehouse either. So when we produce these numbers, we then went to our members, who are meat companies and hide processing companies, and asked them, okay, what are you seeing on the ground? Are you seeing 17% of your production not making it into the supply chain? And what we found is, of course, for the very large meat packers, they are probably not the ones that are putting these hides into a landfill. Some of them might be, depending on the selection, the quality level, but they're probably not, because those are typically very high quality hides that are still going to make it into the leather supply chain. But what we found was, and our members did agree with us, was a lot of the smaller meat packing companies, a lot of the smaller hides, a lot of the smaller mom and pop kind of organizations were not able to send their hides to any sort of hide processor or leather tanner in any given way. So the only thing they had to do as an option was destroy those hides by sending them usually to a landfill. In terms of cost of sending a hide to a landfill, it depends on where you are in the US. It could be anywhere from $5 per piece to up to $12 per piece, depending on what the local regulations are for dumping those hides. Some of those hides might have ended up in rendering. We do know that rendering is a process of breaking hides down into, and other byproducts down into their base proteins for gelatin and collagen production. But the problem with that is hides are not actually very good for this process. It does require specialized equipment. Most renderers don't typically use cattle hides in their production. So it's very hard for the industry to turn that on and off to accept hides. They gum up their processes quite a bit. So we do think that the vast majority of those 5.5 million hides, unfortunately, ended up just being dumped. And I'll be honest, this year, with the way the world has been going and the supply chain has been working for hides and leather, we're continuing to see that number forward, if not worse. More hides probably ending up in the dump. And I'll be honest, Vera, I receive a call about once a week from a small meat packer in the US somewhere saying, hey, I'm just throwing away these hides. Is there any other thing I could be doing with them? Is there anything else I could be doing that's productive with these? And unfortunately, the answer is I don't have much to tell you. It's there's no value for these things, and we as a system haven't figured out how to use them yet. So with that, I'm gonna leave it. I know that's a rough note to leave on, but happy to take some questions.
And we do have some questions from earlier in the presentation. So going back to the greenhouse gases, what's the rationale that can explain animal methane decomposed carbon dioxide is better than fossil fuel produced carbon dioxide? When the former carbon dioxide can be used by plants for photosynthesis, why not the latter also be absorbed in the same way?
Well, certainly the latter can be absorbed in the same way, but we're emitting so much carbon dioxide via fossil fuel production and burning of fossil fuels that we've overwhelmed the system of carbon sinks to be able to absorb those. There's some pretty famous greenhouse gas and atmospheric scientists. Dr. Frank Mittler is one of the main ones who have said, we're not going to eat our way out of greenhouse gas emissions. We're not going to eat our way out of global warming. So the primary driver in global warming is fossil fuel emissions. And so no matter what we do in terms of planting more carbon sinks or preserving rainforests or things like that, we're just not going to keep up as long as we're burning fossil fuel based fuels at the rate we are. So we're talking about an apples and oranges system here in terms of animal agriculture has been around for thousands, if not millions of years. And so this has already been a fortuitous system that has figured itself out and is circular. Now we've overwhelmed that system with a completely different source. And that's why we need to be focusing on that source of the problem and not what we've had for millions of years that produces our food.
Okay. How can we revert the negative press against leather?
with a hope and a prayer.
Yeah,
I think a lot of the industry is now looking at this and ways to do this. I know I'm not the only one by any means, and some of my colleagues are watching this webinar who are actively working on this. I think we can fight with facts. I mean, there's been a lot of misinformation that's spread in the news media and the popular media, and I think we can fight this fight with facts, but we need a lot of voices making those arguments. There is not a lot of, unfortunately, there's not a lot of people from our industry that are out there making the argument. And I'm only one person. There's a couple others from other associations who are on here. There's only a handful of us that are really trying to make those arguments in the popular media. And what we need is more of a chorus of voices from the industry really making these arguments. And this is on social media. This is in Twitter and LinkedIn and some other places like that, where we do need to have kind of a lot more voices coming out and saying, well, wait a second. If you're going to look at greenhouse gas emissions, you need to be doing it in a proper way and really give context to everything we're doing here, and not just accept cherry-picked data, cherry-picked stories from media as truth.
Okay. And I'm not sure you have this answer, but someone is asking, what is the carbon dioxide footprint of 1 square meter of leather compared to the footprint of 1 square meter of vinyl or faux leather?
I don't have the information off the top of my head. Obviously, a lot of it would depend on where that leather is produced, as well as the other materials. I know the industry is looking into this, though, quite a bit. I think there's a lot of interest in establishing different carbon footprints of different types of leathers, depending on how they've been processed. Perhaps there's some regionalization there, but I know the industry is actively looking into this question, and hopefully we'll have some resources on that in the near future.
Yeah. Someone says maybe we should collect $100 million and do an ad with Messi in favor of leather. And that's a soccer star, right?
Yeah, I hesitate to say we could even purchase, get him for $100 million. That might be cheap. But yeah, and that's exactly what some of our groups have been doing. It's not necessarily going after the likes of Messi or some of these really top people, but we've definitely been producing these types of consumer and brand facing promotional campaigns. So Leather Naturally has one called Mecha. Our association has one called Choose Real Leather, or Real Leather Stay Different. And there's One for Leather, which is a lot of the auto leather companies have come together. So there's quite a lot of effort around this, but it's going to take a little bit of time, and it's going to before it really sinks in. And frankly, we're late to the game in this as an industry. A lot of other industries have been doing these types of campaigns for decades, and we are now just getting into it as leather. So it's going to take some time. It's going to take some investment, and one day we'll get Messi, but maybe when he's a little bit cheaper.
Okay. Someone is also asking about the accuracy of the percentage of wasted hides, because they're saying that it's too much for the U.S. Total of cows, that 17% is going to waste.
Yeah. And we frankly thought the same thing when we first started putting those numbers together. And of course, it's an estimate, okay? I will be the first one to tell you that most people in the leather industry know, and the hides industry know, our data is just not very good for our industry. So we're going off of a lot of anecdotal evidence as well. But we ran the numbers, and then after we landed on that 17% number, we sent it around to our companies who are producing these hides and say, what does this sound like to you? What are you seeing day to day? And most of our companies came back and said, yeah, 17%, 15 to 20%, somewhere in there. That's about where we are in terms of hides that are not making it to market. So can we quibble about whether it's 5.5 or 5.6 million? Sure. Absolutely. And I'm open to any of that. But the fact is, it's still a large percentage of U.S. cattle hides that are not making it into leather production, which also means that a lot of percentage of world cattle hides are not making it into production. So, the U.S. is a developed system. We have a developed supply chain. And if those hides aren't making it into the leather supply chain, then neither are hides from a lot of less developed areas. And so this is a global problem that we're facing.
Okay. Someone is also asking, in talking with designers, they're complaining that they have less profitability using leather compared to alternatives. And how can we change that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic point. And that's one of the big problems we're facing as an industry. Plastic is cheap, especially with oil prices going the way they are. Plastic is very cheap. It's a very cheap material to use. And until elements of the circular economy really take hold, and until manufacturers are being held accountable for what their end of life, their product's end of life is going to be like, we're going to have a hard time as a leather industry competing with plastic. It's a lot cheaper. But I think the tide is starting to turn in our direction on that, because at some point, some of these manufacturers are going to have to look at the end of life of these plastic materials, and they're going to see that there's a cost associated with those that has not been baked into what they've been paying for the plastic. And I think leather has a much better argument when you start looking at those from an apples to apples perspective.
Okay, we have getting close on time, but I have two questions I want to get in there. Someone is asking about the reference, if you know, for the U.S. Department of Agriculture peer-reviewed report on what if the U.S. went vegan.
Do we need a reference for it?
Do you have one?
Yeah. I'm happy to send it out. I don't have it right in front of me, but You can Google it, USDA Vegan Agriculture Study Report. The study came out in 2018, I believe,
Okay.
and it's on a U.S. government website, so it's public. I'll be happy to share that with APLF after we're done here. But it's a widely available paper. It's been cited in a number of popular media as well.
Okay. One last question. What is your view of the recent kind of what we here call shopping spree by Chinese tanners taking advantage of the cheap U.S. hide price to accumulate their stocks?
I quickly get myself in trouble if I talk about market conditions for hides or leather, so I'm gonna talk around that a little bit. I think, I mean, hides are historically low. You know, obviously we're in a point where we're destroying hides. So of course, China being the largest leather producer in the world, there's going to be people that are out there bargain hunting, looking for as many hides at a low price as they possibly can. So I think that's natural for the industry. I'm not going to go into specific price points or anything like that. I get myself in trouble there, but I think it's it's naturally based on where we are in the market generally.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we have loads of questions, but not loads of time. So I think we are at the end here. Yes? Thank you, Steve, for sharing everything with us today. I think it was very eye-opening, gives us a lot to think about, and moves for the future and how we do need to group together to preserve leather and make sure that it's being used and not 5.5 or 5 million or however many. Even one hide going to waste is too many.
Absolutely, Vera. I agree completely. And thank you for hosting today, and APLF as well. I'm happy to always talk about this issue. It's one that's near and dear to my heart. And for the questions that are coming out, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to have an engaged dialogue with people from the industry, especially people who may not know that much about the leather industry or the cattle industry or beef industry. So very happy to keep this conversation going offline.
Great. Thanks to all our viewers today, and thanks to APLF.
Yes, thank you for Stephen and Vera for the presentation. And you guys, if you have any questions, you can always email Stephen or leave your questions in the Q&A box, and we will send a report to Stephen and Vera and follow up. And yeah, I believe this is a very important topics to the entire leather industry. But don't forget to follow our social media platform. And next week, we have Debbie from the Leather Lecturely to talk about why leather is the oldest recycled materials. And if you are interested, make sure to reserve your seats by scanning the QR code and share to your fellows. You may also find the link in the chat box. And don't forget to complete the survey before you leave. And you may click exit the webinar, and it will direct you to the survey. And that's all for today's webinar, and I hope you have enjoyed it. And thanks everyone, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.